Hello, I'm Cami Abernathy, Dean of the Herbert Wertheim College of Engineering. Thank you for joining us today. We have an exciting presentation planned for you. We're thrilled to have Dr. Mark Tehranipoor here with us as he discusses how machine learning and artificial intelligence have played major roles in improving offensive and defensive capabilities in the cyber domain. Dr. Tehranipoor is the Intel Charles E. Young Preeminence Endowed Chair and Professor in Cybersecurity in the ECE Department at the University of Florida. He also serves as the director for the Florida Institute for Cybersecurity Research, National Microelectronic Security Training Center, Science Center of Excellence, and ECI Transition Center. His current research interests include IoT security, hardware security and trust, supply chain risk management and security, counterfeit electronics detection and prevention, and reliable circuit design. Dr. Tehranipoor has published extensively in the field of hardware security and has delivered more than 200 invited talks and keynote addresses. He has 8 patents and has published 13 books and 22 book chapters. He is a recipient of 13 Best Paper Awards and nominations, as well as the 2008 IEEE Computer Society Meritorious Service Award, the 2012 IEEE CS Outstanding Contribution, the 2009 NSF Career Award, and the 2014 Muri Award. His projects are sponsored by both industry and government. He serves on the program committee of more than a dozen leading conferences and workshops, and has served as program and general chair of several leading conferences and workshops. He co-founded a new symposium called IEEE International Symposium on Hardware-Oriented Security and Trust, HOST, and served as HOST 2008 and HOST 2009 general chair. He is currently serving as HOST chair of steering committee. He is also the co-founder of Trust Hub and Asian Host. He serves as co-EIC for the newly established Journal on Hardware and System Security, and has also served as an associate editor-in-chief for IEEE Design and Test, an IEEE Distinguished Speaker, and an ACM Distinguished Speaker from 2010 to 2014. He is currently serving as an associate editor for JEDA, JOLT, Transactions on VLSI, and Transactions on Design Automation for Electronic Systems. Prior to joining the University of Florida, Dr. Tehranipoor served as the founding director of the Center for Hardware Assurance, Security, and Engineering and the Comcast Center of Excellence in Security Innovation at the University of Connecticut. Dr. Tehranipoor is a fellow of IEEE, a Golden Core member of the IEEE, and a member of ACM and ACM SIGDA. He is currently serving as the IEEE Ambassador on Cybersecurity. Clearly, Dr. Tehranipoor is one of the world's leading experts in cybersecurity. With that, I will hand it off to Mark to begin the presentation and discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cami, for the kind introduction. Let me first share my slides. If you let me know whether you can see. Do you see my slides?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. Well, Dean Abernathy, thank you very much for first inviting me to give this this presentation to your audience. It's really an exciting time at UF. AI and AI initiatives have done extremely well, and under your leadership, as well as the cybersecurity program 6-7 years ago. This school was not known for cybersecurity, but the program that you put in place and some of us contributed to making it to where it is today really speak for your leadership and the vision that you have provided for this College of Engineering at the university. Thanks for the kind intro as well. Although I must say that bio is not meant to be read. And as you were reading it, I said, I'm not sure if that's me, because it sounds like somebody else didn't have a lot of time to get that done. But I really appreciate you going through the bio and your kind intro. So with that in mind, I want to talk about AI, cyber, and hardware security. And this is a topic that have been keeping me and my team busy quite a bit over the past several years. And I kind of separated hardware security from cyber security, even though really they're not really separated. So the reason is because when you look at cybersecurity and the first virus that was generated around 1984, really everything was around software and network security, and rightfully so, because majority of the attacks were very much focused, and information security was very much focused around those issues until about somewhere in mid-2000, where supply chain became a major problem, and no longer cybersecurity professionals could make an assumption that the hardware underlying information system is trusted because that wasn't the case anymore. So hardware security as a supposedly an emerging topic area, but an integral part of the cybersecurity start to grow and grow fast. And supply chain and the way things have changed actually contributed quite a bit to that as well. And of course, over the past 10 years, we've seen tremendous growth in AI and growth of AI as well, even though some of us know that AI has been around since 1950 and 1960s. But on and off, neural network got some attention in 1990s. But again, complexity of the network and then lack of enough computational power wasn't able to justify using neural networks until later on, where in end of 2000 and then beginning of 2010, 11, computational power allowed us to be able to run these sort of algorithms fast and quick. So there's a lot of problems within both domains. I listed quite a few of them as ransomware and malware and IoTs and 6Gs and physical related type attacks, etc., which I'm going to try to cover them as much as I can during the course of this presentation. But before we get to details of some of these issues, let's take a look at where we are right now with respect to both cybersecurity and AI. The global cybersecurity spending has gone up significantly, and we're looking at $200+ billion global spending in 2021. And by 2025, the expectation is that we're going to get to almost $250 billion global spending. It's a growth of almost 58% per year. Now, AI also has seen significant growth as well, where by 2021, we're looking at $86 billion. By 2025, we're looking at $204 billion, but the expectation is that the growth is going to continue and continue strong when it comes to artificial intelligence as well. And one reason that this spending is increasing significantly is because the number of breaches and attacks are increasing. Digital transformation, unfortunately, has made a lot of information move into the digital domain, in the cloud domain, and embedded systems and edges and fogs, etc. That I'm going to describe more about it, but it really now is resulting in a larger loss per business, per incident, per year. So, for example, IBM report shows that $2.86 million in 2020 per incident per business, and sometimes even up to 200 days spent on finding the actual breach that happens. In 2021, that number is expected to increase to $4.24 million again per business per incident, and this is the 17-year record that has been provided. Unfortunately, COVID made things worse because we're looking at 300% increase in cyber attacks reported by FBI. So that gives you an idea of why that spending is up. When you look at solutions that are needed for cybersecurity, AI is actually going to come in and provide a significant amount of support and resources that is needed. Of course, AI has a lot of interesting applications that is not going to be covered in this talk and only focusing on cyber and hardware security. And the reason is because the complexity of the problems that we're dealing with and the data that is generated could actually help us to develop intelligent tool to be able to help with the cyber threats before they actually happen. And in fact, DARPA came up with this term called predictive AI. So in other words, the assumption is that AI come in to be able to provide predictive risk intelligence, risk assessment, to establish some kind of automation in threat modeling, monitoring, and detection, and so on and so forth. Take an example in healthcare. Unfortunately, healthcare has been a major target by attackers. SANS Institute's report that 94% of healthcare organizations have been a victim of cyber attack at least once. And if you look at the trend and the shift that is happening when it comes to healthcare domain, not only the clinical systems have been advanced significantly, the data that is generated and the move toward cloud and cloud-based computing that is happening, but also medical devices are being actually much more accepted to be part of basically human body, and we see more and more of this sort of devices that are coming in to help you with all sorts of illnesses that patients have to deal with, where these devices can come in and provide some level of either detection or compensation when needed. And unfortunately, these devices are also subject to attack. In fact, these devices have to communicate constantly through Wi-Fi to your monitoring devices and systems, let's say a mobile-based device, and then from there, of course, to the cloud to be able to provide the intelligence necessary to be able to process the information. And the issue we're running into is that those devices have to be secure because that's your privacy, that's your sensitive information, and so on and so forth. And by making those devices secure, you're probably reducing the battery lifetime that these devices carry. So it's a question of how much of a lifetime we're looking at, how much of a battery lifetime we're looking at, and how much of a security we're going to get, and how often a patient have to go through surgery to be able to plant that device into the body, right? So you could see there are important decisions that have to be made in that domain. There's a lot of different type of attacks that have been reported on healthcare systems: ransomware, malware, phishing attack. Social engineering is always a major problem, and of course, denial of service and distributed denial of service that we deal with. So just take ransomware as an example. I'm sure majority of you, if not all of you, have heard about ransomware issues. In a nutshell, in ransomware, what we're looking at is the issue of your system, your computing system basically is taken over by a bad guy, and the data within your system is encrypted. And until you pay a ransom, you're not going to get key to be able to decrypt that data, right? And there have been some ways to try to protect it. The problem, however, has grown manyfold and become basically a top US security agenda, especially after Colonial Pipeline hack that has happened. One of the important actually event that happened about 2017 when ransomware got significant amount of attention was this attack that was made on country of Ukraine, where the ports and corporations and government was completely frozen and shut down because of a ransomware attack that happened, even power plants and so on and so forth. And this numbers that we're looking at are mind-boggling. For example, in 2019, we're looking at roughly 85 schools and universities, 100 local and state governments, and more than 700 healthcare providers suffered from ransomware attacks. And as a result of some of these prevalent attacks that are happening, insurance companies coming in and provide this thing called cyber insurance policy, similar to your car, your home, etc. And of course, you pay annual fees to be able to protect it or compensate it if such attack happen and there is a loss of business, etc. And City of New Orleans announced that, hey, the $3 million cyber insurance policy was not enough to cover all the costs associated with the ransomware attack that happened in the city. So there have been some solutions, and the solutions are usually what they call them rule-based solution or signature-based solution, where we're looking at the number of ransomwares and we try to generate a signature based on those previously identified ransomware attack and use them as a way to be able to develop defensive mechanisms against those type of attacks, right? However, AI could potentially play a major role in detecting ransomware and zero-day because there's a significant amount of data that could be collected. If there's an AI agent running on your machine, is looking at various activities that are happening, and then by trying to analyze the data being collected, etc. And based on the data, the agent has been trained to develop a model and use the model to be able to perform the monitoring and then try to check if there is some kind of anomaly that's happening in the system and flag this as a suspicious activity. And then, of course, with additional processing, you could identify whether there potentially a ransomware is happening or a malware happening. So because of the data that is made available, that could potentially be a very effective way of doing this. And in fact, if you establish your model using AI on known attack, it could be pretty effective, but it could also potentially provide a solution to monitor malicious behavior and anomalies that fall into category of unknown type of attacks or potentially 0 days, that AI-based method could be very effective in detecting them. The challenge we're running into is that AI could potentially be used as a way to also strengthen ransomware attack. And especially that when we're looking at nation states now are being increasingly engaged in ransomware type attack, they could use tremendous amount of AI resources that are available for launching attacks. And to do that, they could develop AI agents that can monitor the detection capabilities of existing ransomware detection methods to understand what the signature level is, what the thresholds are being used to generate ransomwares of different levels that could potentially go under those accepted signatures or thresholds, and at some point potentially go undetected through that detection process that is put in place. But AI could potentially do more. AI could profile people to target in various organizations. It could actually do data poisoning, because if you are using an AI machine to be able to protect yourself against ransomware, that AI machine is going to evolve over time by capturing more data. But your machine as an attacker could potentially provide noise in the data that the AI machine is using, to a point that at some point that noise could make the AI agent ineffective in identifying some of the newly generated ransomwares. It could potentially also help discover paths for spreading malware, because malware is one way to get you into the system so that you can actually run additional malicious functionalities. We can also look into model extraction using AI as an attacking agent, where it can actually try to figure out what the other AI machine is using, what model they're being used. And those models could potentially be understood by the AI attack machine as well. So you could see how the defense and offense in this scenario, unfortunately, could work, and attackers, as always, if they want to use AI, in this case also are going to have the upper hand in the game that we play when it comes to cybersecurity. When you move from ransomware to malware, there's a lot of similarities in the way the malware and ransomware behave, but the detection method also to some degree is the same. Either a signature-based or anomaly-based or a specification-based. One of the important challenges we run into malware is the sheer number of malwares that are generated. An institute in Germany reported that they actually identify a new malware every 0.2 seconds. That translates to almost 500,000 number of new malware detected every day. And by the way, these are malwares that are detected. The best malware detection techniques out there right now are as good as 70 to 80%. Which means that there's a large number of malwares that actually go undetected, unfortunately. So this really requires us to move away from these traditional defensive methods that are static, that are trapping-based methods, as well as signature-based method, rather to go more of a attack mode and look at it as a hunting-based approach or a strategy. In this case, what we need to do is to identify what is considered to be a good behavior, and model a good behavior using an AI machine, and be able to identify a lot of things that consider to be anomalies. Of course, not all anomalies are bad, because for every system that we design, we're looking at certain corner cases that we may not necessarily cover when we perform our good behavior modeling, but it could actually raise flag when it sees those anomalies. And good behavior modeling requires significant amount of data. It requires time to be able to collect the data and then perform this training for developing the AI by AI model, by capturing, processing, and classifying virtually every program, every user behavior, and every possible corner conditions that we need to consider to be able to establish a good model, right? And that could be potentially doable, especially for a lot of IoT devices that have very well-defined functionalities. That's not necessarily the case for many IoT devices, and as well as some cyber physical systems. But when you look at a lot of medical devices, security cameras and doorbells, etc., these systems, even though they're all connected to internet and they and your Wi-Fi, and they potentially could be VCAS linked for an attacker to get in, they have very well-defined functionalities. When they have well-defined functionalities, AI could be very effective actually in helping identifying those potential attacks in those scenarios. A challenge, however, when it comes to malware detection and AI is this notion of anomalies are bad, that not necessarily all anomalies are bad. And also this notion of overfitting. Sometimes we feed so much data to AI so that and we overfit the model so that every possible differentiation between what actually happening and what the data is being collected and what actually model tells us could potentially be flagged as an anomaly and then be considered to be bad, which is not always the case. And to be able to address this issue, we probably need to come up with the solutions that normally we use for overfitting, which means that we need to change or augment. We need to augment some of the good data with the bad. We need to reduce the size of the model so that it can actually be able to respond better with respect to identifying some of those anomalies. Another important thing when you think about AI and malware detection is protecting the AI agent and AI machine itself. If the AI potentially is being maliciously changed, that could potentially cause catastrophic effect as well. I'm going to go through a couple of other important applications before I get to my own research in this area. And one of them is the move now towards 6G. Of course, we're far from 6G, right? And you know, and we know 5G exists today, given all the commercials that you see in the TV today. But the reality is that first 5G devices was ever developed actually happened in 2013 or 2014. So we're looking at 7-8 years of development so that 5G became a reality. And I think 6G is the same as well. To the promise of getting another 50x to 100x increase in speed and throughput from 6G compared to 5G is quite attractive. So we're looking at about 6-7 years from today to have 6G reality. And the promise says that you can get, let's say, 200 Netflix movies downloaded in 1 second. And you wonder whether we actually need it. And the answer is, of course not. But that's not designed for you downloading your Netflix movies even faster. Rather, it is created for cases of the future. We're looking at autonomous vehicles that are driving in the street. These autonomous vehicles require 6G to be able to communicate with thousands of other autonomous vehicles as well, so that they can coordinate the driving routes, so that you will never get stuck in a traffic, right? Having that many cars to communicate instantly requires a different set of network that 5G perhaps is not designed for. And to go to 6G, we're looking at sub-millimeter wave. And sub-millimeter wave basically reduces the reach that antennas have. And the change basically that's supposed to happen is that we will have to increase the number of edge cells, antennas, and devices by another 10-fold, which means that we're going to have some of those cells implanted in the buildings, not only in the buildings, but also in the units. Not only in the units, perhaps part of your furniture as well, because sub-millimeter wave will not be able to get from an antenna to every home in the areas. Which that brings the question again, what are the security issues? Because once you have that many of cells are available and devices are required to be in line of sight, to some degree, it helps with manning the middle attack, but there are so many other type of attacks that could potentially become problematic, especially when these devices become accessible, physically accessible potentially to the attackers. The other type of attacks that already existed in 5G, they're going to carry over to 6G, and those attacks are happening at the edge layer, at the control layer and application layer. We expect to see similar attacks to continue to appear when we move to 6G. Personally, I believe that the physical layer will be a much bigger problem. Another important thing when it comes to 6G is that a lot of the decision-making and communications and authentications actually are going to be handed over to AI, and that basically brings it to the physical layer, and a lot of edge AI is going to become handy to be able to expedite those sort of authentication. And generally, this sort of authentication used to be done in form of fingerprinting, that you communicate with another device and make sure that there are certain fingerprints that are being exchanged that identify that the other user is authentic. One important change when we go from 5G to 6G, besides using AI more effectively, is this notion of zero trust and zero touch. Zero trust means trust no one, authenticate everyone, every time. And zero touch means everything is password protected and you require a unified authentication framework. Personally, I believe that AI is going to play an important role here to be able to enable that authentication in a fast and efficient manner. Moving from 6G now to IoT. Similarly, AI has played a significant role in IoT devices for both protecting IoT, but also, unfortunately, attacking IoT devices. The IoT devices, the prediction of having 50 billion IoT devices by 2020 probably has already become reality, because if you look at every individual today, you're looking at your cell phones, your TVs, your set-top boxes, and game console, doorbell, security cameras, and Fitbit, and so on and so forth. These are all the devices today that are connected to the internet and to Wi-Fi, to your network. The high degree of device heterogeneity actually makes IoT devices a big target. And if you look at Mirai botnet and the DDoS attack as happened, took advantage of a series of components and IoT devices that were fabricated by a particular vendor, and was able to use those devices as zombies and then carry a certain denial of service attack toward a number of social media and brought those social media down for several hours. So AI could potentially come in and actually provide significant amount of capability here. In fact, if you look at the community that is built around AI, it's called TinyML. TinyML actually has grown quite a bit. TinyML basically says that we could potentially have a smaller version of machine learning algorithms to be implemented, in this case on the edge, and those algorithms can run on devices that are not potentially computationally powerful, but also some of these devices require a certain battery life. And if you start running a very advanced and complex machine learning algorithm on those devices, you're going to drain the battery life quite fast. So TinyML at the edge is probably one of the very interesting solutions. And I'm going to share with you some of the work we do in that area to be able to help with detection of malware and malicious change at the edge. Unfortunately, as I said, AI could potentially be impacted by, could potentially be used to work against IoT devices as well. And an example of it would be that, imagine that in an airplane, you have various sensors, and sensors are providing health monitoring and providing information about, let's say, the engine. And these sensors, if they're taken over by an adversary, could potentially feed a small amount of noise to the model that is measuring and also evolving over time. And that model could potentially start to make certain decisions that, well, the lifetime of engine is more than what potentially is expected. And if that's the case, unfortunately, it could have catastrophic effect. And so this is an example of how AI could potentially be used to be able to understand what the noise are and then use them as a way to create adversarial cases, right? And unfortunately, in IoT domain, we see more of this as physical attacks, man-in-the-middle attacks, false data injection attacks, botnets, and DDoSes are all guided by artificial intelligence being used as attack engine. Moving from IoT to cyber physical system security, we've seen a big change there as well. The sensors and actuators that collect the information from the field used to transmit that information to the cloud. However, we're moving the AI now to the edges, so some of that decision actually could be made at the edge itself. And this requires significant amount of data to be collected so that the model could be trained based on what's considered to be a legit action or behavior and what's considered to be done by bad guys. And the model basically now can be transported to the edge, and at the edge that information can be processed real time. Another example I want to give you is this notion of deep fake, which I'm going to run this video just for a few seconds for you to see if you're not familiar.
Modern, I think people can say that my election symbolizes some progress, at least within the small confines of the legal community. To help families refinance their homes, to invest in things like high-tech manufacturing, clean energy, and the infrastructure that...
Okay. So the video was short, and I know that the sound was not very clear. The objective was not to understand exactly what is said, but the reality is that the words that are coming out of former President Obama actually has been manipulated, right? So this is done using leveraging deep learning and artificial intelligence to be able to manipulate and generate visual and audio media with a high potential to deceive. And we've seen that, unfortunately, there's a rise in deepfakes you know, the notion of misinformation and disinformation has been a topic of discussion for over the past few years. Congress and Senate jumped on this because this is considered to be a national security threat, and passed laws to be able to protect against this sort of attacks that are happening. But clearly, this is a deep learning in AI, basically at its best, right, from attack standpoint, but at best because it can actually take an individual and be able to create situations where that individual in a video is actually speaking perhaps in a certain way that is against certain ideologies or policies, etc., that we believe in, and that could have a profound impact on individuals who may not necessarily always go and have the time to be able to perform their own fact finding. So deepfake obviously got significant amount of attention. With that, I'm going to go into some of our work that we do in this area for the hopefully next 10, 12 minutes. I'll leave some time for Q&A. Just to give you a little bit about how we address some of the challenges that I mentioned. Let's take ransomware as an example. And in case of ransomware, we actually look at the microarchitectural events that happen inside the computing platform. When a ransomware hits, it starts to execute certain functionalities. The functionalities usually is looking for the various hard drives and where the storage is, and then from there identifying the files and moving them, encrypting them, and so on and so forth. The microarchitectural events that happen are closest to what really that program is running. And there's this pattern that is generated. If you could train your AI agent using some of the existing ransomware and identify based on those events that are happening, using using AI model, you would be able to train the model in a way to be able to differentiate ransomware from, let's say, a benign behavior. And as more of this happened, then this thing again evolve and become much more accurate. The work that we've done actually was able to detect the ransomware in less than 100 milliseconds. But if you look at some of the other work that have done, it could potentially go into seconds and minutes. So the reason that this was successful at doing this and identifying ransomware in such a short period of time, in my opinion, is because the events are better indicator of an intent and a behavior where sometimes you extract that information at a higher level of abstraction. Another interesting research that the team is doing is this notion of malware detection at the edge. In this case, we're looking at IoT devices, and these devices are capturing a significant amount of information, for example, power and EM, taking advantage of analog behavior of a device that is a representative of the functionality and operation that is happening inside the system. So identifying, for example, whether the benign program is happening versus a ransomware or malware is happening is actually quite easy when you think about running it at the edge, because you're looking at it two completely different power or EM profile. What we did, however, we took it to the next level. We wanted it to see if we can identify even an instruction change. Forget about instruction. What about an operand within an instruction? In other words, the change is so subtle that only an operand with a one number potentially has changed. And what we wanted to do as part of this program and training our model to be able to actually identify that kind of a fine-grained change that happened in the IoT devices firmware. And we've been able to actually point to specific instructions that have changed in the program, a specific operands that have changed in the program. And this is done by, again, capturing power traces, performing the composition, doing 1D to do the transformation, do our feature selection, and then train the model using a neural network, and then running it on the device as we make those changes and be able to flag whether those changes have been detected. Another important topic area that my team has spent quite a bit, and in fact within the fixed research, is this notion of supply chain vulnerability. Understanding supply chain is very important in establishing security both at hardware level and cyber level. And you wonder, okay, what does AI have to do with supply chain vulnerabilities? And I say a lot, and because of the different type of vulnerabilities that we have to deal with. We're looking at malicious change, sidechannel attacks, malicious implants within the embedded systems, information leakage, fault injection attack, as well as piracy of intellectual property. Just to give you a couple of examples in that area. For example, when we look at the chips that are fabricated today, unfortunately, majority of the integrated circuits are fabricated offshore today. So DoD consider this to be an untrusted foundry. And in this case, the goal is that you pick a chip from the market and then you try to figure out whether there is any malicious change made into the chip. If you design your chip, you have a golden net list available to you to be able to compare with. What we do basically is we inserted some number of gates within this design, and we call them golden gates. The golden gates actually are going to be used for training our support vector machine as a classifier so that we can identify individual cells. And once they pick the chip, perform basically imaging from backside of the chip and look at those doping regions. We identify each of those cells using this classifier. And if we identify something that is not supposed to be there, we consider them as an anomaly. And then we basically do further analysis to see if this was a malicious change or some of the design for manufacturability changes that usually foundry makes. But this is a very powerful solution using AI to be able to help us to uniquely identify each cell so that we can provide or establish trustworthiness. Another interesting problem that we deal with in this supply chain domain is this example attack that was reported by Bloomberg, that the Supermicro's motherboard, as you see here, this motherboard actually has applications in national intelligence community, Amazon, Facebook, Cisco, Samsung, just name it. And these customers basically have been using this device for years, but it was published that for years, this systems actually have been compromised by an offshore facility in another country. And the way the compromise happened was that there was a very small millimeter-sized chip that was designed mainly for this to carry this attack. And the chip actually was hidden under a jumper in one case. Another case actually in between the layers. These motherboards usually have between 12 to 20 different layers. And these chips are too small and they can easily fit between the layers as well. And this chip was responsible for hijacking the entire system during the boot up process, right? So we worked on this since 2013. And then when this attack happened, obviously we were contacted by many companies to ask for the solution. And what was the solution? The solution basically required to perform surface level analysis by taking images of the chip of the PCB and identify every one of the components, whether it's active parts or passive components or interfaces and communication parts, etc., to identify each and every one of them, and also to be able to go between the layers and analyze each layer to see if there is any particular change that was made in between the layers. This is really for security purpose, but the research basically now went into reliability and quality assessment as well. But in the security, the focus was on identifying malicious modifications, malicious insertions. Somebody could reverse engineer and pirate the IP and so on and so forth. So there's a significant amount of work to be done. But in each and every one of these work, AI is an actually important part of what we do. In this case, for example, take the surface level assessment. We first generate significant amount of data that unfortunately did not exist in this field over the past many years that I'm working on this. And this is basically to generate the data so that we can start training our models. And then take a PCB, put them under the optical device, take images from different angles, and then go through the entire process of detection and classification so we can identify parts, part numbers, tags, logos, markings, and also identifying different parts and whether they're integrated circuits, whether they're capacitances and inductances and resistance and so on and so forth, identify traces, and then eventually put the entire bill of material together. Once you have the bill of material, once you have the entire layers in between, then you can basically go to the next step and then try to establish your trustworthiness of the system. An ongoing research in the team right now is actually on this notion of digital twin. You might have ever heard about digital twin. Digital twin basically is a digital model of a physical world. You can take a car as an example. In this case, if you're driving a car and the car runs in a, let's say, a pothole, and then something breaks, the sensors in the car captures that, and real time that information actually goes to the model of the car, let's say in Ford cloud. The model captures that information with the sensor information and says what happened that such a potential failure happened. The model is going to improve itself and then send that information to the facility, to the manufacturing line. In real time, the changes are made to be able to make sure that the next line and the next cars or the next generation of cars perform better. Similar things we're actually doing in the semiconductor and electronic domain as well. What we're doing is we're establishing a virtual model of the physical devices. And these devices basically go into the field, go through the fabrication, testing, packaging, and then go into the field. The behavior of the system is always captured by on-chip monitors and in-system monitors. Those information are constantly being communicated to the digital twin, and the model constantly is going to be able to perform assessment. So the question that we try to address is how to assure security across the entire life cycle. How can AI help us to be able to perform security at the throughout life cycle? And then where did it go wrong that we can take that information and then feed it back to the model and then let the AI agent to take over and perform this analysis. And the way we do it is basically what we call them a forward trust analysis and backward trust analysis using AI machine, right? And we're using also causality analysis and that sort of things to be able to establish a relationship between what the data tells and potentially which entity was responsible in making that particular vulnerability to appear, whether it was a third-party IP vendor, whether it's a rogue employee or a foundry, or end users in the field. Just to give you a couple of other interesting examples. We talked about AI as a protector. We talked about AI as an attack agent. Let's talk about protecting AI itself. And one of the things we've been looking at is this notion of, AI itself is an IP. There are companies that are basically their livelihood, their profit comes from the fact that they actually spend R&D on developing right AI models that they can sell it to different companies, system companies, that they could use it for their application. So those AI IP are very important. But once those are being sold, the other companies can potentially give it to other entities or sell it and make money out of it. How do you make sure that you always have a way to provide proof of ownership? As I said, IP piracy is a huge problem, and I don't expect that AI IP piracy would be an exception. So we expect that this would be an issue. And our team has been looking at this notion of watermarking. So I'm sure many of you have seen watermarking, whether in the documents that are being exchanged or cash currencies, etc., right? So in this case, what we're doing is we're trying to develop this owner-specific signature that can be hidden within this model that we train, that become your secret. Of course, it is combined with an encryption and a key that becomes your secret, and you're the only one who knows what that key and that secret message actually is. Anytime you get a system that indications are that your AI model is being used, all you need to do is to be able to apply your input and collect the response, decrypt it using the key that you have, and extract that message. And that message could be whatever you like. This AI model belongs to Fix Research Institute. You can take that message and then hide it into this model without actually having that message to impact the quality of the model. Rather, it's something that you only will use it for watermarking extraction purpose. Another interesting example in that domain, probably my last one, is this notion of using AI for secure physical design. And in this case, what we're looking at is that the systems that we're building, if they're not designed with security in mind, when they go and being used, or integrated circuit, they're being used in the system and system of system, unfortunately, they're going to carry that vulnerability with themselves. If you think about the Rowhammer, is a device level security. If you think about fault injection, side channel type attacks, and so on and so forth, these are all hardware related vulnerabilities that unfortunately at the later stages in the design and fabrication and system development, etc., could be taken advantage of. right? What we're doing is we're basically trying to bring AI machine, in particular reinforcement learning, to help us to have a secure floor planning, a secure placement, and a secure routing in place when we build these chips and integrated systems with billions and billions of transistors to ensure that throughout the design, throughout the field and lifetime, these devices actually remain secure against those type of attacks. One of the important type of attacks is this notion of side channel. What we do is that we actually try to use side channels to extract the keys, your encryption keys, your locking keys, your other credentials that we store inside the chip. We could use side channel attacks to be able to extract those keys. And unfortunately, AI-based or deep learning-based attacks have proven to be very effective in carrying these attacks. In fact, as part of this analysis, we teamed up with NIST to help them with the assessment of post-quantum crypto. NIST that they almost few last stage of their selection of which algorithm is going to be their recommended post-quantum crypto. And as you may know, AES and DES are what NIST has produced now for post-quantum crypto. They're going to have to make that final decision. So they're down to 3 final candidates. Our team came in about 7-8 months ago, and we've been able to show them how each and every one of these post-quantum crypto algorithms are actually susceptible, more or less, depending on severity of that susceptibility to side channel attacks. And we continue working with them to help perform that kind of assessment, to help them to show that how fast, given how many number of traces and using which AI agent, we've been able to actually extract those keys carefully. One of the important things that got their attention quite a bit actually was this notion of AI-based attack, because the statistical methods that have been around for almost 2 decades have shown to be very effective, but AI unfortunately have made it to be even more effective than expected. So in conclusion, I must say that AI and cybersecurity are here to stay. And there are, we live in a we live in a world that bad guys are going to be around, and as long as bad guys are around, I'll be around, and so many of my colleagues in the Fix Institute. And AI in cybersecurity not only is going to play a major role, but I think that many tasks that we perform and the assumptions that we made in the past now are going to be challenged by the power of AI. And I can clearly see how myself, from an individual who was very much a heuristic guy when it comes to a lot of solutions that I developed over the past many years, now have moved slowly but surely toward using AI in assessment and developing countermeasure. And they're here to stay because digital transformation cannot be stopped. And I have to give a shout out to college and university for making that investment and having the initiatives, especially NVIDIA initiative, in place in both areas that made the UF to be one of the leading institutions in the country when it comes to artificial intelligence, hiring a large number of faculty, outstanding faculty. And now with cybersecurity to being one of the leading, if not the leading institute in the country, together they could provide breakthroughs in this area. One of my initiatives is to increase collaboration with the College of Law when we deal with the policies within cybersecurity as well as AI, as well as Warrington College of Business when you think about supply chain and supply chain security. Another important activity for us is to increase industry participation and collaboration with focus on AI and cybersecurity. Fixed research historically over the past 6 years has done extremely well working with both government as well as industry. Last time I checked, we probably have about 50 or 60 total number of sponsors over the past 6 years that are from actually industry. We want to continue doing that, but we see more and more interest from industry in talking to us about AI related issues in cybersecurity as well as supply chain and hardware security. I want to thank a lot of my colleagues. I presented a lot of work to you guys today, but reality is that this is a result of a close collaboration with outstanding faculty in Fixed Research Institute and a lot of excellent students. I'm certain I didn't include a lot of other students that they have had contribution here and there to the material that I presented, but it's really a great group of people to work with, and none of this would have been accomplished if this wasn't because of their outstanding contribution to this work. With that, Cami, I'm going to end my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mark, for that fascinating presentation. As Mark said, we're now going to allow questions from the audience, so please post your questions in either the Q&A or the chat box. We've already got a couple of questions. Let me start with this one. First of all, compliments for your work. The first question is about ransomware work. Can you elaborate on how the microarchitecture level profiling of events maps those events to the high-level semantics and program ransomware intent? This questioner's understanding is that these low-level events are often noisy and their mapping to intent is not necessarily one-to-one, thus affecting the accuracy of the user space process labeling.
That's an excellent question. Very good question. So the reason that we found actually low-level microarchitectural activities to be very effective is because in case of ransomware, there are certain functionalities that have to take in place. Encryption has to take place, movement of file have to take place, and so on and so forth. And when you look at those activities actually are less noisier than some other activities which basically getting your ransomware software into the system and then try to monitor that. The program execution that results into microarchitectural events that you are very high confidence in generating those events are less noisier, therefore make the method to be much more effective.
Great. The second question from the same questioner, with a signature model-based technique like the one you advocate for ransomware detection, can you elaborate on the potential of signature drift, as in model drift, whether intentional or unintentional? For example, potential adversarial ML concepts can be employed to generate functionally equivalent event traces with mismatched feature projections.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, I hope I didn't give the impression that I'm actually advocating for signature-based approach. I was mentioning that signature-based approach actually is widely used for ransomware detection. However, with the advent of AI and capabilities that are added by AI agents would be able to actually examine a signature-based approach the same way that you just described. In other words, they would be able to do the machine-generated ransomwares that would be able to examine how your model, your signature model is effective in detecting them. Therefore, they would be able to understand what type of ransomware with certain signatures that they can generate to go undetected. So in fact, the example that you provided is what I believe that makes AI-based ransomware generation very scary.
Thank you, Mark. Please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A or the chat. I'm going to take this opportunity to ask a question of my own. So, Mark, there's been a lot of emphasis, a lot of discussion lately about the chipsets used in cars. They tend to be older generations. And there's some discussion of, in order to improve the supply of these chips, they should upgrade to more modern generations. Will that make them more or less secure? Are they more secure by using old generations, or will they be more secure by using the newer generation chipsets?
That's an excellent question. And how much time do we have to discuss about this issue? So you pointed to something quite fascinating. And I think this notion of chip shortage, as you mentioned, especially with focus on older technology nodes, has had billions and billions of dollars of negative impact on businesses. And you hear cars, basically, they had to shut down the assembly line because certain chips just simply were not available. Now, as you suggested, can we move toward a more advanced type of chips? And the answer is yes. And why is not happening? And the reason this is not happening is following. There is this cycle that it takes to go from a chip to a system, and then from system to a system of system. Usually in automotive environment, we're looking at 3 to 5 years. In other words, a chip that actually come into my car today, that chip was developed and tested at least 5 years ago. So that in that 5 years, we have moved on 2 or 3 technology nodes already, right? And that, unfortunately, is the reality. And it's not just for the cars. We basically see the same thing in many, many other transportation systems and financial systems and medical systems, that they don't normally actually use the latest version of the the technology nodes, that's the 14 nanometer or 10 nanometer, 7 nanometer. Why? Because by the time those chips are available to go through that cycle of bring up to the system level, we're looking at the same amount of 4 to 5 years. So that's one major issue. Does it make it better with security? If that was ever possible, I say yes. And the reason is following. We're moving toward this new generation of computing platforms that they bring in these capabilities of root of trust as well as reconfigurable fabric to be added to the system. The root of trust that is being added to the chip makes sure that many of the sort of attacks that we actually have been discussing could potentially either be removed or alleviated. And insertion of reconfigurable fabric actually makes the device to some degree upgradable, similar to what we do in the software level. When today, in the past hour or so, that I would say 45, 50 minutes that I gave this presentation, and based on the data that I shared, we probably have seen, again, somewhere around 400,000 new malware that have come to the market and nobody is shivering. But when you think about hardware issue, however, if this was the case, the company that was subject to that kind of an attack probably lost half of its stock value. This is why addressing this sort of issue is important, and upgradability could enable us to be able to provide the same upgrade or patches necessary that we have today for software to be able to do the same for hardware. So in short, it's difficult to give a yes or no to that question, Cami, but it's really the added functionality and capability will put us in a much better position to be able to deal with some of these vulnerabilities that I discussed today than focusing on the older technology nodes.
Is our personal data potentially safer on our ground-based computers or in the cloud with a data storage provider?
Well, I guess I have to leave this question to those folks who are expert in cloud computing. It's hard to give an answer to that. I think it really comes down to what sort of data we're looking at, right? If you're looking at your biometric and your important bank accounts versus, let's say, some photos, etc., that they are important to you, but necessarily don't put them into the same category, then you have to make a decision as to how to deal with this and where they could be resided, right? Personally, I do all of that. I have some of my information in cloud. I do have a lot of my information on my personal computer, and a lot of my actually sensitive information in hard copy and in my own safe. So it's really come down to certain preferences on how comfortable you will be to deal with some of those issues. And I must tell you that we did not talk about one issue that actually is related to your question, and this notion of insider threats. And been actually looking at a recent attack that was made in certain individuals, that those attacks became repeated, even though that information was in cloud environment. And the basically conclusion was that there is an insider threat. If there is an insider threat in some companies, doesn't matter how much of a security you put in place, your information is going to be in jeopardy.
This will probably have to be our last question, Mark. Have you looked at using a supervisory processor that resides on die next to the RISC machine that uses metadata from the application compiler to stop the processor when it tries to access memory inappropriate for the application?
Yeah, it's a good question. And the answer is no, I have not. But have I seen other researchers to actually develop similar solutions? Yes. And again, each of them, they have their own pros and cons. And the reason is because you're dealing with intent and a bad guy who is as intelligent as defenders, if not more intelligent, right? And metadata can get you somewhere. Microarchitectural data can actually get you somewhere as well. Can a more hybrid approach be more appropriate in addressing the problem? That may be actually the way to go, that you know that certain type of noisy behavior at the microarchitectural may actually have that particular malicious behavior to go undetected, and they take that information to analyze it at the later stages of the, or later layers of the system to be able to do further analysis. And this is why we have this notion of what we call a defense in depth, right? In security domain, you will never basically rely on one solution and one stage and assume that you're protected. The notion of defense in depth basically tells you that you can take some of the issues away at the lower level and then some left Then you go to the next layer and put your next defense. Then you go to the next layer and the next defense. At some point, you make it too expensive for an attacker to be able to continue carrying that attack, and hopefully they give up. Unless it's a nation state attacker, which is probably that may not be the case.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. There have been a number of plaudits in the chat and the Q&A, and I just want to add my thanks as well. This was a tremendous presentation, and I want to thank you for presenting it and for all of our attendees for participating today. We will be hosting another webinar soon, and we'll be in touch later with those details. I also wanted to let you know about an opportunity available to each of you to increase your working knowledge of AI. The University of Florida has launched a new AI professional development program with 7 AI short courses developed across 4 colleges to upskill the workforce across several AI disciplines. The program includes asynchronous and synchronous formats to meet the needs of industry. These short courses were developed by the same faculty who teach UF classes and are actively engaged in AI research. Each short course also includes a free 1-hour component as an intro to the subject. If you're interested, the registration link is in the chat box. Feel free to check it out. And again, I want to thank Dr. Tehranipoor and all of you for being here today. Please have a great day and go Gators.
Go Gators. Thank you, Cami.